Tonight, we enter one of the most unsettling corners of the UFO mystery. Close encounters with beings. Not just lights in the sky, not just radar returns, distant objects, or strange shapes moving above the clouds. These are the cases where witnesses said the phenomenon came closer. Close enough to see figures. Close enough to feel watched. Close enough for the encounter to become personal. Across schoolyards, farms, forests, lonely roads, and quiet fields, ordinary people reported moments that seemed to break the boundary between our world and something unknown. Some accounts became famous. Others remained local, whispered, disputed, or half forgotten. But each one leaves behind the same question. If even a fraction of these witnesses were telling the truth, what exactly did they meet? For the next 2 hours, these are the stories of close encounters with beings. Listen closely, and let the night decide what it believes. The Ariel School encounter. On September 16, 1994, at a small rural school in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, more than 60 children ran across the playground shouting about something extraordinary in the bush beyond the field. Teachers, busy with a staff meeting inside, at first dismissed the commotion as the usual childhood excitement. But when they came outside, they were confronted by a group of pupils who insisted they had seen a craft land, and strange beings emerge from it. What followed became one of the most compelling mass witness UFO cases in history, remembered today as the Ariel School encounter. The incident took place at mid-morning recess. The children, aged between 6 and 12, were playing when several noticed a silver, disc-shaped object descending into the scrubland that bordered the school. The craft, according to their accounts, settled near a clump of trees. Some described it as round with a dome, others as elongated, but all agreed that it gleamed in the sunlight. What startled the children most, however, were the figures they saw standing beside the craft. Descriptions varied slightly, as one might expect from young witnesses, but certain details remained consistent. Small beings with large heads, slender bodies, and striking, dark, elongated eyes. The entities seemed to move with a gliding quality rather than a normal human gait. Several children said the beings looked directly at them, and they felt a sense of communication not with words, but with thoughts. In later interviews, many of the pupils spoke of receiving impressions or messages during this silent exchange. The themes that emerged were strikingly similar: warnings about environmental destruction, about the dangers of humanity's misuse of technology, and a plea for greater care for the earth. These messages left a lasting impact on the children, who recounted them with unusual seriousness for their age. When the teachers heard the initial reports, they were skeptical. But as they listened to dozens of children describe the same event with striking consistency, their disbelief began to waver. That very day, some of the staff walked to the area where the craft was said to have landed. They found the ground disturbed, but no clear physical evidence. What convinced many was not the site itself, but the sincerity and detail of the children's testimony. Within days, the story spread beyond the school. Local media picked it up, and soon outside investigators arrived. Among them was Dr. John Mack, a psychiatrist from Harvard University and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Mack spent time interviewing the children individually, often using gentle methods to help them recount what they had seen. What struck him was the depth of their conviction. The children described the beings and the craft calmly, often drawing similar sketches without having consulted one another. Their emotions ranged from awe to fear, but none of them seemed to be inventing a story for attention. Mac's involvement elevated the case to international prominence. He concluded that the children had experienced something real, though its exact nature remained beyond explanation. He emphasized that their accounts were sincere and consistent, and that the impact of the event on their young lives was profound. Other researchers who visited reached similar conclusions, noting that the children's stories held steady over time, with little variation despite the pressures of media coverage. The Ariel School encounter has often been compared to other mass witness UFO events, but it stands apart for several reasons. First, the number of young witnesses was unusually high, and their testimony was recorded promptly after the event. Second, their descriptions of the beings and the telepathic impressions they received carried themes that were not common in local culture at the time. Third, the case was investigated not only by UFO researchers, but by professional psychiatrists and educators who vouched for the sincerity of the accounts. Skeptics have suggested that the incident might have been the result of mass hysteria, imagination, or even a prank. Yet, these explanations falter against the consistency of the children's descriptions and the depth of emotion they displayed when recalling the encounter. Mass hysteria typically fades quickly, but decades later, many of the former pupils continue to affirm that what they saw was real. Interviews conducted years later found that their stories remained unchanged, their memories vivid, and the impact enduring. The Ariel School case also highlights a broader theme within UFO encounters, the sense of communication or message. Unlike reports that focus solely on strange lights or craft, this event emphasized content, a warning about humanity's stewardship of the planet. Whether one views this as a projection of the children's own concerns or as a genuine transmission from an unknown intelligence, the effect was the same. The encounter left a deep, lifelong impression. Today, the site of the school remains a quiet place, but the story continues to echo across the world. Documentaries, books, and interviews revisit the day when ordinary children in Zimbabwe saw something extraordinary. For those who experienced it, the memory is not one of fantasy, but of a vivid, life-changing event. The Ariel School encounter endures because it resists easy dismissal. It was not a single witness, not a fleeting light, but a community of children describing the same remarkable thing. In their drawings, their words, and their memories, they conveyed a moment when the ordinary rhythm of recess was shattered by the extraordinary. What landed in the bush that morning remains a mystery, but the voices of those children, clear, consistent, and unshaken even decades later, ensure that the story remains one of the most powerful and haunting UFO cases ever recorded. The Varginha Schoolyard Landing, January 20th, 1996, Varginha, Brazil. It started as a scream. 3 teenage girls, Lilian Silva, her sister Valkyria, and their friend Katia Andrade Xavier, were walking through a vacant lot on Rua Benevenuto Braz Vieira, a quiet residential street in Varginha, a small city nestled in the hills of southeastern Brazil. It was around 3:30 in the afternoon on January 20th, 1996. The sky was cloudy, the air thick with humidity, and the streets mostly empty. The girls had taken a shortcut home after school, laughing, teasing, skipping across the overgrown path when they saw it. The thing squatting by the wall wasn't human. It was small, about 4 feet tall, with brownish skin, a massive head, and bulging red eyes that seemed to glow. Its arms were long and thin, its body frail. Most disturbing of all, it appeared injured or sick. A viscous, white fluid oozed from its skin, and it emitted a strong ammonia-like odor. The creature didn't move, it just watched them. Katya screamed first. All three girls turned and ran, heartbeats pounding in sync, their schoolbooks forgotten on the path behind them. They reached home and breathlessly told Lillian's mother what they had seen. She thought they were joking, but their pale faces and trembling voices said otherwise. Within the hour, the story had spread across the neighborhood. By nightfall, Varginha would never be the same. What followed is often described as Brazil's Roswell, a case with multiple sightings, military activity, secretive recoveries, and even medical intervention, one that would leave a deep scar on the community and ignite a national controversy that still burns today. As local reports of the strange creature reached the press, others began stepping forward. At approximately 1 a.m. that same day, before the girls' encounter, two local farmers, Eurico and Aurelina de Freitas, were woken by the sound of cattle panicking. From their kitchen window, they saw a large, cigar-shaped object silently hovering over their field. It emitted a faint humming and had lights blinking along its side. The craft slowly dipped behind a hill and disappeared from sight. Hours later, a local fire brigade was summoned to the city outskirts to retrieve what was initially believed to be an injured animal. Witnesses near the wooded area described seeing heavily armed military personnel, some wearing hazmat suits, combing the area. Civilians were pushed back, told to leave, and threatened with arrest if they interfered. Around the same time, military trucks were spotted entering and exiting the grounds of Escola de Sargentos das Armas, the local army school. One truck was seen carrying a large metallic crate covered by a tarp. That same day, multiple roadblocks were reported on surrounding highways. The official government stance? Nothing unusual had happened. But Varginha residents weren't buying it. The most damning testimony came from members of the city's fire department, who later confessed, off the record, that they had retrieved a non-human biological entity at the request of the military. One firefighter, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said the creature was alive when captured, severely weakened, and made a high-pitched sound unlike anything he'd heard before. Perhaps the most tragic chapter came from the hospital. On January 22nd, just 2 days after the girls' sighting, 23-year-old military police officer Marco Eli Cherez was rushed to hospital in serious condition. He had been part of the team reportedly involved in capturing a second entity found crawling near a drainage ditch. Within weeks, he died of a mysterious systemic infection that bled through his organs. His medical records were sealed. The hospital's chief attending physician, Dr. Roger Lair, later alleged that the young man's symptoms did not match any known viral or bacterial infection. Cherez's family, particularly his mother, insisted until her death that her son had been silenced. Multiple petitions to have his body exhumed were denied by the military. Several hospital staff also came forward. 2 nurses and a physician claimed to have seen a strange, small being wheeled into the Humanitas hospital under heavy military guard. One nurse described the stench as chemical and unbearable. The being, they said, died shortly after. That same week, an unmarked plane was reported departing from Campinas Airport carrying a sealed container. Local journalists claimed it was transported by military escort and never registered on cargo logs. Many suspected the container held the body, or bodies of the creatures recovered in Varginha. The government's explanation? According to a press release issued weeks later, the girls had seen a homeless, mentally impaired man named Mudinho, who lived in the area and was known to wander shirtless and dirty. The press was shown a man who bore little resemblance to the being described. But by then, the story had gained international attention. Brazilian ufologists, led by researchers like Ubirajara Franco Rodrigues and Marco Petit, began gathering first-hand interviews and compiling timelines. They documented at least 7 independent sightings across the city, all within a 24-hour window, by children, farmers, firefighters, nurses, and military personnel. The media dubbed it Ocaso Varginha. Local television stations aired witness testimony. Sketches were published. Conferences were held. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came not from Brazil, but from the United States. In 2002, retired U.S. Air Force intelligence officer John Carpenter revealed in an interview that NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, had tracked an unknown object descending over southeastern Brazil on January 20th, 1996. When Brazilian authorities inquired, they were told it was a satellite re-entry. No satellite records ever matched that date or trajectory. More recently, in 2021, filmmaker James Fox released new footage and interviews for the documentary Moment of Contact, which featured exclusive testimony from military personnel involved in the recovery operation. One former soldier, face blurred and voice altered, described loading a body bag that moved into the back of an army vehicle. And then there's the town itself. To this day, Varginha has embraced its place in the unknown. Statues of cartoon aliens decorate the streets. A UFO-shaped water tower looms over the city center. The local tourism board offers ET tours to key locations involved in the incident. But behind the playful branding, a quiet unease still lingers among older residents. Many who lived through the event believe a cover-up took place. Some remain afraid to speak, even decades later. Others are tired of telling their stories, only to be dismissed. And yet, despite the noise, the core remains. 3 terrified girls. A glowing craft witnessed by dozens. A military response no one wants to explain. A dead soldier whose medical files vanished. And a government explanation that asks its people to believe that over a dozen civilians, police, firefighters, and hospital staff mistook a homeless man for an extraterrestrial being. Sometimes the lie is more absurd than the truth. As for the creature the girls saw, it never came back. But the image they described, frail, silent, with huge red eyes and oozing skin, has become an icon in Brazilian UFO lore. In the end, the Varginha incident is not a story of belief. It's a story of contradictions, of frightened witnesses and confident denials, of secret flights and silent deaths, of files locked away and a town left with too many questions and too few answers. What really landed in Varginha that day remains a mystery. But something did. The Boianai mission encounter. June 26, 1959, Papua New Guinea. The Anglican missionary raised his hand toward the sky, and to the shock of nearly 40 witnesses, one of the figures on the hovering craft raised its own hand and waved back. Gasps spread across the mission yard. Children clutched at their parents, teachers whispered in disbelief, and nurses pointed upward. Hovering above them was a broad, disc-shaped craft, luminous against the darkening horizon. On its deck, 4 figures stood in silhouette, moving deliberately as though engaged in work. What had begun as an inexplicable light in the sky had become something far stranger. beings who seemed to recognize the people watching them from the ground. The evening had started quietly. Father William Booth Gill, an Anglican missionary from Melbourne who led the Boianai station, had been preparing notes for a sermon when he noticed a bright object low on the horizon. At first, he assumed it was Venus, a familiar planet that often shone brightly over Papua New Guinea. But the light dipped, glided, and shifted in ways no star ever did. Curious, he called several others outside, teachers from the mission school, nurses from the clinic, and villagers soon joined him, craning their necks toward the sky. As the object drew closer, its structure became clear. Witnesses described a broad metallic disk glowing with pale radiance. Across the top was a flat surface like a deck, illuminated just enough that the silhouettes of 4 figures could be seen moving back and forth. Their movements were purposeful. They bent, turned, and lifted their arms as though adjusting unseen instruments. Their proportions were human-like, not towering giants, not miniature beings, but figures whose motions were deliberate and coordinated. The crowd stood transfixed, every eye fixed on the strange craft. Gill, calm but deeply curious, decided to test whether the figures were aware of their audience. Slowly, he raised his arm and waved. To his astonishment, one of the figures on the deck raised its own arm and returned the gesture. Gasps rose from the yard. Some pointed, others whispered. Encouraged, Gill waved again. Again, the figure waved back. Soon, others in the yard began to wave as well, and the responses continued. The exchange lasted several minutes. It was not a fleeting illusion or a trick of light. Children saw it. Teachers saw it. Nurses and villagers saw it. The beings on the deck were not simply visible. They were interacting. Gill later wrote, "To our utter surprise, one of the figures waved back. We waved again, and the gesture was repeated. There seemed no doubt, whoever they were, they acknowledged our presence. For those present, the experience was surreal. It was as if the gulf between earth and sky had briefly closed, bridged by a simple human gesture. The encounter unfolded over nearly 45 minutes, long enough for witnesses to observe and discuss what they were seeing, even as it happened. Several smaller luminous objects detached from the main craft, glowing spheres that drifted nearby before rejoining. Gill described them as shuttles, moving with controlled precision rather than random drift. Meanwhile, the figures on the deck continued their movements. Sometimes they bent forward as if adjusting controls. At other times, they stood still, observing. The waving was repeated multiple times, never hurried, never frantic, deliberate and clear. At last, around 7:30 p.m., the craft began to ascend. The smaller objects merged back with the larger body. Its glow faded as it climbed higher, until it disappeared among the stars. At least 38 people saw the event. The crowd included mission staff, teachers, medical personnel, villagers, and children. All described the same details: a disc-shaped craft, 4 figures visible on top, smaller luminous objects detaching and returning, and an unmistakable waving gesture exchanged with those on the ground. Gill's own background lent credibility. Born in Melbourne, he had studied theology and was regarded as a thoughtful, educated man. He was respected in the community and not prone to fantasy. His diary entries that night recorded the encounter with clinical precision, noting times, directions, and descriptions. Other witnesses corroborated his account in writing. Teachers explained how the figures bent forward as if working. A nurse confirmed the repeated waving. Children remembered how the yard had filled with gasps each time the beings lifted their arms. Consistency of detail across nearly 40 witnesses is rare. Here, every account aligned. That night, the mission yard buzzed with conversation. Children imitated the waves, adults spoke in hushed tones, and Gil carefully wrote down the details in his diary. The next day, he prepared a formal report, including sketches of the disc, the deck, and the figures. The report traveled through church channels to the Australian administration in Papua New Guinea and soon reached the Royal Australian Air Force. The case was not dismissed. Upon returning to Australia, Gil was interviewed by intelligence officers. His diary was examined, his sketches reviewed. Other witnesses were questioned. The official summary labeled the event an unexplained aerial phenomenon observed by a large number of witnesses. There was no suggestion of fabrication. Instead, the case was quietly archived. Decades later, when researchers accessed the released files, they were struck by how matter-of-fact the investigation had been. This was no rumor or legend. It was a carefully documented case preserved in government records. Over the years, skeptics offered alternatives. Some claimed the witnesses had mistaken Venus for a craft. Yet Venus does not hover low above the horizon, emit smaller objects, or display human-like figures waving. Others suggested it was an aircraft. But in 1959, no plane or helicopter could hover silently for nearly an hour, let alone reveal people visible on its deck. Mass hallucination was proposed. But hallucinations do not occur collectively across nearly 40 people of different ages and backgrounds, all describing the same details independently. Each skeptical theory collapsed under the specifics of the case. The simplest explanation remained the testimony itself, that the witnesses saw exactly what they reported. For Gil, the encounter was not threatening. He never described the figures as hostile. Instead, he emphasized their familiarity. They appeared human, friendly, and had gestures we recognized. Whoever they were, they acknowledged us as we acknowledged them. This calm interpretation has always distinguished the Boianai case. Unlike stories of abduction or terror, this was a story of recognition. Two groups looked at each other across the gulf of sky and waved. The Boianai mission encounter stands out among UFO reports because it was a close encounter of the third kind, not just lights in the sky, but visible beings. And it was not the only such case. In Kentucky in 1955, families at Kelly reported small beings approaching their farmhouse during a night of fear. In 1965, in Valençol, France, farmer Maurice Mass claimed to see two figures near a landed craft in his lavender field. In 1989, in Voronezh in the Soviet Union, crowds of children and adults reported towering beings stepping out of a landed craft in a city park. Each case was controversial, yet all shared one theme. Occupants observed, and in some cases interacted. What set Boianai apart was its clarity and calmness. No panic, no chaos, but a simple exchange of gestures witnessed by nearly 40 people. It showed that such encounters were not confined to superpowers or military sites. They could happen in remote villages, among teachers, children, and missionaries, leaving behind testimony that resisted easy dismissal. The Boianai mission encounter remains one of the clearest, most enduring UFO cases of the 20th century. A disc hovered in full view of nearly 40 people. Figures stood on its deck, moved deliberately, and waved in recognition. The exchange was mutual, calm, and undeniable. Perhaps that is why the story endures. Not for fear, not for mystery, but for the silence that followed, the silence of a mission yard where people stared upward in awe, of children who reenacted the waves, of a missionary who recorded the event with precision. For one evening, in 1959, earth and sky acknowledged each other, and when the craft departed into the night, it left behind not confusion, but certainty, a memory still vivid, still unresolved, and still extraordinary. The Gary Wilcox contact. April 24th, 1964, Newark Valley, New York, USA. The sun had just begun to crest over the ridge of the Catskill Mountains, casting long golden rays across the farmland in Newark Valley, a quiet agricultural town tucked into upstate New York. Gary Wilcox, a 27-year-old dairy farmer known for his reliability and quiet demeanor, was already out working. Morning mist clung to the soil like a second skin, and the rhythmic hum of insects had only just begun to stir. It was a crisp spring morning, April 24th, 1964, and Wilcox was doing what he did most days, tending his land and checking on his manure piles, which he used to fertilize his expansive fields. As he guided his small tractor across a secluded section of his farm on that serene morning, something caught his eye that would change the course of his life and become one of the most mysterious and underexplored cases in American UFO lore. There, resting silently in the clearing, was an object shaped like a large white egg. Roughly 4 feet tall and uniformly smooth, it sat motionless in the grass about 75 feet from where Wilcox's tractor came to a halt. It was like nothing he had ever seen, not a piece of farm machinery, not a weather balloon, and certainly not debris from an aircraft. It had no seams, no windows, no wings. Just a strange, white, oblong pod resting slightly off the ground. Curious and unafraid, Wilcox stepped down from his tractor and approached the object cautiously. The object was eerily silent and cold to the touch, despite sitting in the early morning sun. That was when, to his astonishment, 2 small beings appeared from behind it, or perhaps from within it. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. The entities stood about 4 feet tall, dressed in seamless metallic-looking suits that shimmered slightly even in the weak morning light. Their heads were disproportionately large, and their faces were concealed behind visors or reflective coverings. Their proportions weren't quite human, but they moved smoothly and confidently. Wilcox later recalled that he felt no fear, just an overwhelming sense of calm and curiosity. And then they spoke. The beings communicated in perfect English, but in a manner that seemed detached, almost as if the words were being translated in real time. They told Wilcox they were scientists from another planet, interested in Earth's soil and agricultural development. They said they had chosen him because of his remote location and his occupation. Farming, a universal profession tied to sustenance and planetary health. For the next 2 hours, Wilcox conversed with these strange visitors as they asked him questions about farming techniques, fertilizers, and human nutrition. In turn, they explained they were gathering data on Earth's ecosystems and conducting tests on organic material. Wilcox described the encounter as matter of fact, not dramatic or overwhelming. He was given no warnings of impending doom, no grand philosophies, just scientific curiosity. They asked not to be photographed or reported. Wilcox promised them that he wouldn't tell anyone, and with that, they concluded the encounter. The egg-shaped object then simply lifted vertically without a sound, and disappeared into the sky. No heat, no wind, no explosion of light. Stunned but not terrified, Wilcox went back to his usual chores and told no one. But just hours later, on the very same day, April 24th, another major UFO incident would unfold almost 2,000 miles away in Socorro, New Mexico. A police officer named Lonnie Zamora reported seeing a nearly identical egg-shaped craft land in a gully and take off again, leaving scorch marks behind. That incident would be heavily investigated by Project Blue Book, the U.S. Air Force's official UFO investigation program, and it would become one of the most famous sightings in American history. Wilcox, hearing news of the New Mexico sighting days later, was startled. The similarities were uncanny. He decided to break his silence and called the Tioga County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff's deputies visited the farm and interviewed Wilcox, who recounted every detail with remarkable consistency. The local newspaper picked up the story, and soon he found himself the reluctant focus of regional media. In his original report to law enforcement, Wilcox expressed disappointment that he hadn't told someone immediately. He feared the timing would make it appear as if he were copying the more famous Zamora sighting. But his story was already being quietly investigated. The field where the object had sat showed faint impressions in the grass, though there were no burn marks or radioactive signatures. Unlike other UFO cases filled with dramatic physical traces, this one left almost no residue, just a calm man with a remarkable story and a patch of flattened grass. Skeptics were quick to suggest hallucination, mistaken identity, or outright fabrication. Yet Wilcox's demeanor didn't fit that narrative. He wasn't a publicity seeker, and he never attempted to profit from the story. He gave no paid interviews, refused to go on television, and never changed his account. In fact, he grew increasingly reclusive after the incident. Those who knew him described him as deeply changed, not paranoid, but reflective, as if he'd glimpsed something profound and now carried the quiet weight of it. Interestingly, years later, Wilcox mentioned that he had placed a package of fertilizer near the site after the encounter, just in case the beings wanted a sample. It was gone the next day. As the story faded from public attention, UFO researchers would occasionally revisit it, especially those investigating patterns among contactees. The parallels between Wilcox's encounter and that of Zamora were striking. Both featured a white egg-shaped object. Both occurred on April 24, 1964. Both involved landings and liftoffs, and both were observed by credible, down-to-earth men who never deviated from their original stories. Even more intriguing is the tone of Wilcox's experience. Unlike the typical narrative of fear, probing, or abduction, his was calm, polite, and rooted in shared curiosity. The beings he described didn't threaten, intimidate, or harm. They asked questions. They seemed more interested in Earth's agriculture than in any form of invasion or experimentation. Despite decades of retellings and re-examinations, the Wilcox encounter remains largely under the radar in the broader conversation about UFOs. Perhaps because it lacks sensational drama, but it's precisely its simplicity that lends it an eerie credibility. The incident is still cited today in cases comparing peaceful contact scenarios and so-called low-profile visitations, where communication is personal and private, almost tailored to the witness's profession or lifestyle. Some UFO researchers now categorize such encounters as experiential studies by non-human intelligences, testing not just biological samples, but human reactions. And what of Wilcox himself? He lived out his days in Newark Valley, occasionally speaking to researchers who contacted him but otherwise avoiding the limelight. He never tried to embellish the story, and in his few public remarks years later, he seemed thoughtful, if not wistful, about what had happened. "I don't know what they were," he once said. "I just know I didn't imagine it." There were no other sightings at his farm, no follow-up visits, no definitive evidence left behind. But the questions linger. Why Wilcox? Why a farmer? Why that date? And what were these beings really after? Was it truly just a scientific exchange, a brief moment of mutual curiosity across worlds? Or was there something more? A test? A first contact? A quiet message that the extraordinary doesn't always come with thunder and light, but sometimes with the gentle hum of a tractor and the early sun glinting off dewy grass. Whatever the truth, Wilcox's story remains one of the most grounded and perplexing accounts in UFO history. A moment when the cosmos may have reached down, not with fear, but with interest in our most fundamental human endeavor, growing life from soil. The Cussac Close Encounter. August 29th, 1967. Cantal, France. The sun rose lazily over the rolling green hills of Cantal, France, bathing the fields in the soft golden glow of a late summer morning. It was the kind of quiet, pastoral day where not much was expected to happen. Sheep grazed without urgency. The wind whispered through the grasses. And on this particular day, two young siblings, Francois and Anne-Marie Deville, were doing what they always did, watching over their cattle. Francois, 13, was perched on a rock with his little sister Anne-Marie, 9, sitting beside him. The two were used to the routine. Their job was simple: keep the cows within the pastures and make sure none wandered into the woods or down toward the village road. The day was as uneventful as any, until a soundless shift in the air made them both turn their heads. Francois squinted toward a small hill just across from where they sat. There, near the edge of a stone wall, stood 4 small black figures. They were humanoid in shape, but shorter than any adults the children knew, barely over a meter tall. They wore tight, dark suits that shimmered faintly in the morning light. At first, Francois thought they might be kids from a nearby village playing some strange game. But then, something happened that no game could explain. The figures began to levitate. In stunned silence, Francois and Anne-Marie watched as all 4 beings rose slowly into the air, effortlessly, smoothly, as if the laws of gravity simply didn't apply to them. Just above them hovered a luminous metallic sphere, roughly 3 meters wide, completely silent. The sphere gave off a whitish-blue glow that pulsed softly in a steady rhythm. The beings ascended in perfect synchronization until they entered the underside of the craft, which then vanished instantly. No flash, no roar, no wind, just gone. The children screamed. Francois, terrified yet determined to understand what he'd seen, ran to the exact location where the figures had been standing. Anne-Marie followed close behind, tears welling in her eyes. They scanned the area, trying to make sense of it. There were no footprints, but a patch of scorched grass marked the spot where the object had hovered. The cattle nearby had backed away and clustered together, visibly uneasy, some even bellowing in agitation. The animals' behavior alone was enough to convince Francois that they hadn't imagined the whole thing. The 2 children ran to their home, about a kilometer away, and breathlessly recounted the event to their father. He knew his children were not prone to making up stories, and they were visibly shaken. Within the hour, the local gendarmerie was informed. Officer Jean Boulaire of the Saint-Flour station was the first to arrive on the scene, and he took the matter seriously. He noted the scorched grass, the disturbed cattle, and the clarity with which the children repeated their story, without contradiction. A formal report was filed that day. The French gendarmerie quickly escalated the case to the local medical services and scientific advisors. Francois and Anne-Marie were interviewed separately and subjected to psychological evaluations. Doctors confirmed both were in good health and showed no signs of delusion or trauma unrelated to what they described. Their statements remained consistent under repeated questioning, even weeks later. The French government, already aware of increasing reports of strange aerial phenomena across Europe during the 1960s, quietly dispatched a team of investigators from the GEPAN, the official UFO research group under CNES, Centre National d'Études Spatiales. The team collected soil and grass samples, conducted magnetic field tests, and took radiation readings. The scorched patch showed signs of sudden high heat exposure, though there was no evidence of conventional combustion. Electromagnetic readings were inconclusive but abnormal. While the scientific team maintained neutrality, Officer Boulaire submitted a personal statement affirming the children's sincerity. "There is no question in my mind that something extraordinary occurred," he wrote. "These children are truthful. They saw what they saw." Local newspapers caught wind of the story, while some articles mocked the children's account, suggesting overactive imaginations. Others treated it with cautious interest, especially given the official involvement. Radio hosts debated whether the sighting was real, a prank, or some kind of psychological manifestation. But most of the townspeople, who knew the de Vilde family well, supported the children. They weren't known for fantasy, and the story never changed. Then came a surprising twist. Just a few days after the initial sighting, a farmer several kilometers away reported seeing a bright ball of light descending behind a forested area near his fields. He didn't see any beings, but his sheep had scattered in terror, and his dog refused to approach the spot for hours. Investigators added this to the case file, noting the proximity and timing. Even more curiously, a week later, a group of school children in a nearby town claimed to see small black figures floating in the air. Their teacher dismissed it as imagination, but when questioned by police, their drawings matched Francois and Anne-Marie's descriptions in remarkable detail. Again, no adults witnessed the event. By now, the GEPAN team had compiled a dossier filled with photos, interviews, and environmental data. One of their internal memos, later leaked to a French UFO research group in the 1980s, stated, "This case remains one of the most coherent and unexplained in the national files. Witnesses are credible. No evidence of deception or mental instability." Despite this, the official government stance remained neutral. No public conclusions were released. The case faded from national attention. Years passed. Francois became a mechanic, Anne-Marie a teacher. Occasionally, journalists and UFO researchers would track them down for interviews, and they always told the same story, never embellished, never altered. "We didn't want this attention," Francois once said in an interview in the 1990s. "But it happened, and we can't pretend it didn't. I saw them. They were real." Skeptics continued to raise alternative explanations. Could it have been pranksters in costumes with some kind of weather balloon? Could the children have experienced a shared hallucination? But none of these theories accounted for the scorched ground, the behavioral changes in the cattle, or the matching accounts from unrelated schoolchildren days later. More importantly, there was no motive, The de Wildes never sought fame or money. One aspect that intrigued researchers was the nature of the levitation. The beings didn't float awkwardly or with the help of any visible propulsion. It was smooth, controlled, and synchronized, as if they were weightless. This detail, repeated by multiple witnesses in other European encounters of the era, became a minor pattern in Cold War UFO literature. The encounter also stood out because of its simplicity. There was no abduction, no communication, no lights flashing across the sky. Just an ordinary day, 2 children doing chores, and an extraordinary moment that changed how they saw the world. In the years since, the Cussac close encounter has become a cornerstone case in French UFO history. It's frequently cited in comparative studies of youth sightings and is featured in official Guipan literature as one of the most credible sightings by child witnesses. Some researchers believe that children may be more open to perceiving anomalous phenomena, not yet conditioned to filter out the strange. But the most haunting detail remains the same. This was rural France in the 1960s. These were farm children, isolated from the urban myths of America's flying saucer craze. Yet what they described, small humanoids, metallic craft, silent levitation, fit neatly into what thousands of others have claimed around the world. Did they imagine it? Or is this a clue that the phenomenon follows a pattern, independent of culture? Whatever the explanation, the Cussac case remains unsolved. The Falcon Lake incident. On May 20th, 1967, in the wilderness of Manitoba, Canada, a prospector named Stefan Michalak set out on what he thought would be an ordinary day of searching for minerals. He was an experienced outdoorsman, meticulous in his routines, and well known in his community as a practical man. What he encountered that day near Falcon Lake, however, would become one of the most perplexing and best documented UFO cases in Canadian history. Unlike so many other sightings that depend solely on witness accounts, this one left behind physical evidence, burns, radioactive traces, and a lingering mystery that has never been resolved. Michalak had been exploring a site near Falcon Lake, a place known for its dense forests and rocky outcrops. Equipped with his tools and supplies, he expected a long but uneventful day of prospecting. Around noon, however, he was startled by the sudden appearance of 2 glowing objects descending through the sky. At first, he assumed they might be experimental aircraft or even helicopters, but their movements were unlike anything he had seen before. One hovered briefly before flying off, while the other landed on a flat rock surface nearby. He cautiously approached, believing it might be a military craft in need of assistance. As he drew closer, he saw that the object was shaped like a disc, metallic and smooth, with a dome-like top. The surface gleamed in the sunlight, and the air around it seemed charged with energy. He later described it as being about 35 feet in diameter, with a seamless, polished appearance. Curiosity overcame his fear, and Michalak walked close enough to touch the craft. He placed his gloved hand against its surface and immediately pulled back. The metal was scorching hot. Through what looked like a small opening or hatch, he glimpsed a dazzling light and heard muffled voices, though he could not make out any words. Hoping to communicate, he called out in English, then in Polish, and even in German, but there was no reply. Within moments, the hatch slid shut. As Michalak continued to examine the craft, a grid-like panel suddenly opened on the side. Without warning, a blast of hot air and gas erupted from the vent. The force knocked him backward, and his shirt caught fire. Scrambling to put out the flames, he realized that his chest and stomach had been seared by the blast. The burns were arranged in a distinctive pattern, dozens of small squares forming a grid. The pain was intense, and he felt dizzy, nauseated, and disoriented. The object lifted silently into the sky, then shot away at tremendous speed, leaving him alone on the rocky clearing. Stunned and injured, Michalak tried to make his way back to civilization. The journey was difficult. He vomited repeatedly and felt waves of weakness overcoming him. By the time he reached a nearby road, hours had passed. He eventually managed to return home, where his condition worsened. His skin blistered, his eyes burned, and he developed headaches and weight loss in the weeks that followed. Medical examinations confirmed that he had suffered radiation-like burns. The grid-shaped pattern on his torso was photographed repeatedly as it appeared, faded, and reappeared over time. His health struggles became a matter of record, and doctors could not agree on the cause. Some suggested chemical burns, but the pattern and accompanying symptoms did not fit. Investigators soon arrived at the site. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and civilian UFO researchers all took interest. The patch of ground where the object had landed showed unusual signs. Moss and vegetation had been scorched in a precise circle. Radiation tests revealed elevated levels of radioactive isotopes, particularly radium-226, in the soil and on samples of Michalak's clothing. The burned vegetation in that circle failed to regrow for years. Skeptics searched for alternatives. Some argued that Michalak had staged the burns himself, though no explanation could be given for why a prospector with a stable family life would endure such suffering for attention. Others suggested that he might have been exposed to industrial chemicals, but again, no chemicals were found at the site, and his injuries bore the strange grid pattern rather than the irregular damage one would expect from an accident. The Air Force examined the evidence closely. Their conclusion was not that the event was a hoax, but rather that the case was unsolved. The Canadian government kept files on the incident for decades, many of which were released years later under Freedom of Information requests. These files documented not only the physical evidence, but also the seriousness with which officials treated the case. For Michalak, the encounter brought little peace. He suffered ongoing health issues, including recurring rashes and stomach problems, and struggled with unwanted media attention. Despite this, he consistently maintained his story. Over the years, he retold the account without embellishment, refusing to claim more than what he had seen and experienced. He insisted that he had encountered something real, though he never claimed it was extraterrestrial. His tone remained matter-of-fact. He saw a craft, was injured by it, and lived with the consequences. The Falcon Lake incident is often described as Canada's most famous UFO case, and for good reason. It involved a highly credible witness with no history of deception, left behind physical evidence, and attracted extensive investigation from both civilian and military authorities. Unlike many sightings that remain ephemeral, this case is grounded in tangible traces: burns on the witness's body, radioactive soil, and scorched vegetation that stubbornly resisted regrowth. To this day, no satisfactory explanation has been found. If it was a military test craft, no records have surfaced to support the theory. If it was a hoax, it was one that left a man with lifelong scars and a reputation he never sought. And if it was truly something beyond human technology, it stands as one of the clearest examples of how close such mysteries can come to ordinary people in ordinary places. Falcon Lake remains quiet now, a place of fishing, hiking, and wilderness retreats. Yet for those who study the unexplained, It is hallowed ground, the site where a prospector walked into an encounter that changed his life forever. The story endures not because it provides answers, but because it resists them. A man searching for minerals in the Canadian wilderness instead found himself scorched and shaken by something that defied all explanation, leaving behind evidence that has never been dismissed, and a mystery that still lingers in the forests of Manitoba. The Imarvi skiers incident. January 7th, 1970, Lake Imarvi, near Heinola, Finland. The winter afternoon over Lake Imarvi was dim and cold. The snow on the open fields was undisturbed except for two narrow ski tracks leading from the forest toward the frozen lake. Cross-country skiing was routine for Esko Viljo, a 36-year-old caretaker, and his younger friend Arto Heino, a 24-year-old mechanic. They knew these tracks well. The open stretch by the lakeside and the winding path that skirted the forest edge. The air was sharp enough to redden the skin, and every push forward made the sound of skis over packed snow ring out against the stillness. They had made the trip many times before. Nothing in the air or on the ground suggested that today would be any different. They were moving side by side along a stretch near the lake's edge when something caught Viljo's attention. Ahead and slightly to the right, a bright point of light appeared against the overcast sky. At first, he assumed it might be a reflection or a trick of the low winter sun breaking through the clouds. But the light did not fade. It grew. The point swelled into a sphere, its brilliance cutting sharply through the gray atmosphere. Heino noticed it at the same moment and slowed, watching as it descended toward them. There was no noise, no whine of an engine, no chop of rotor blades, no rushing wind. The light seemed self-contained, a perfectly steady glow without flicker or haze. Within seconds, the form of an object began to emerge from the glare. Both men could now see that it was metallic, disc-shaped, and no larger than a small car. It hung in the air at treetop height, utterly still. Its surface reflected the muted winter light in a dull, silvery sheen. Before either could speak, a shaft of white light beamed down from its underside. The beam struck Viljo squarely, illuminating him in the snow. He froze, not out of choice, but because his body no longer obeyed him. He later described the sensation as if his muscles had been switched off. He felt a sudden enveloping heat, not like the warmth of a fire, but an intense, penetrating wave that seemed to come from inside as much as from without. His vision swam, and a metallic taste filled his mouth. Heino stood only a few paces away, untouched by the beam, but close enough to see the expression on Viljo's face. A mix of shock, strain, and confusion. He shouted to him, but Viljo did not answer. The encounter lasted only seconds, perhaps no more than a minute, but the two men would later agree that time felt stretched. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the beam withdrew. The disk lifted slightly, tilted on one edge, and shot upward into the low cloud cover, vanishing from sight. The only sound was a faint rush of displaced air that faded into the silence. Viljo's knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the snow. Heino dropped beside him, helping him to sit upright. Viljo's breathing was rapid, and his skin was flushed. He complained of weakness, dizziness, and an odd burning sensation in his face and hands. There was also the smell, sharp, chemical, and unpleasant, hanging in the cold air around them. Heino would later liken it to a mixture of sulfur and ozone. The two men decided to head back toward town. Viljo's skiing was labored, his movements stiff, so they moved slowly. By the time they reached home, dusk had given way to the deep winter dark. That evening, Viljo's condition worsened. His face became puffy, his eyes bloodshot, and his skin reddened in patches as if mildly burned. He also developed a persistent headache and complained of an unquenchable thirst. Heino, though shaken, felt only mild irritation in his eyes, which subsided after a few hours. Concerned, they reported the incident to the local police. The next day, officers visited the area where the encounter had occurred. The snow was undisturbed apart from the men's ski tracks, but in the exact spot where Viljo had been standing, they found a shallow depression and an area of loose, disturbed snow in a neat, circular pattern. There were no animal tracks, no signs of machinery, and no branches or debris fallen from the trees. The case caught the attention of Finnish Defense Forces personnel, who made discreet inquiries. No aircraft had been reported in the area that day. The weather was stable, overcast skies, light wind, and no electrical storms that might account for unusual atmospheric phenomena. Viljo was examined by doctors in Heinola and later in Helsinki. The medical notes, which would later circulate among Finnish UFO researchers, described symptoms consistent with exposure to intense heat or radiation: skin erythema, mild swelling, elevated blood pressure, and general fatigue. No burns or blisters were found, but the reddening of his skin persisted for days. Blood tests revealed no abnormalities severe enough to require hospitalization, and within 2 weeks, most of the symptoms had subsided, though Viljo reported lingering fatigue. For Heino, the experience was primarily one of psychological shock. In interviews with police and later with investigators from the Finnish UFO Research Association, he described the craft in the same terms as Viljo: a smooth, metallic disc, no visible seams or markings, with a bright, concentrated light beam from its underside. His testimony matched Viljo's in all essential details. Civilian investigators arrived within days. The Finnish UFO Research Association, then only a few years old, treated the case as one of the most compelling close encounters they had yet recorded. They documented the site thoroughly, photographed the circular disturbance in the snow, and took statements from both men separately to compare for consistency. The statements matched closely, even in small details, such as the angle of the craft when it departed, and the unusual smell left in the air. Over the following weeks, speculation grew among researchers and locals. Some suggested the men had encountered an experimental Soviet drone or reconnaissance craft, given Finland's proximity to the USSR and the Cold War tensions of the period. Others believed the incident fit into a small but growing category of UFO encounters, where witnesses experienced physical effects after exposure to a beam or light from an unknown object. Indeed, the Imarvi case bore similarities to reports from other countries in the late 1960s and early 1970s, where beams from hovering craft had caused temporary paralysis, localized heating, and other physiological reactions. Unlike many of those reports, however, the Imarvi witnesses were healthy, experienced outdoorsmen, and the incident occurred in daylight on open ground, making misidentification of common aerial objects less likely. By mid-1970, the incident had been discussed in UFO periodicals across Europe. The Finnish Defense Forces maintained no official statement beyond confirming that no known aircraft were in the area at the time. The police file remained open for a short period before being quietly closed without explanation. Viljo returned to work after several weeks, but avoided skiing on that part of the lake for months afterward. Heino continued the hobby, but admitted that he now watched the sky more than he once did. Both men stuck to their original account for the rest of their lives, never embellishing it beyond what they had reported in those first days. For Finnish UFO researchers, the case remains one of the best documented CE-2 incidents in the country's history. The combination of two credible witnesses, immediate physical effects, a clear environmental location, and consistent testimonies makes it stand apart from most reports. In later years, Viljo reflected that the most unsettling part was not the beam itself, but the fact that it had singled him out, affecting him while leaving Haino untouched. Neither man could suggest why that might be. The question lingered. Was the beam a deliberate act of observation, a scanning process, or something else entirely? Lake Imarvi today remains as quiet as it was that winter day. Cross-country skiers still trace the frozen edges. The snow still lies deep in January, and the pale sun still struggles to break through the cloud. There is no trace on the ground of what happened in 1970, but the accounts of Viljo and Haino have endured in Finnish archives and international UFO literature. The case invites no easy answers, only the image of a silent disk, a shaft of light, and a frozen moment in which an ordinary winter outing turned into one of the most puzzling encounters in Finland's modern history, the Tacuarembo CE-2, 1970s Uruguay. The morning sun was still low over the fields of Tacuarembo, a rural department in northern Uruguay, when two officers from the Departamento de Policía de Tacuarembo arrived at a pasture outside a small village. They had been called by farmers, who reported a strange event during the night. What the officers found was puzzling. A perfect circle of scorched earth in the middle of an otherwise healthy field. The grass inside the ring was blackened, the soil dry and brittle, and around its edges were impressions as though something heavy had rested briefly before lifting away. The farmers insisted it had not been fire. No matches, no signs of burning fuel, no smell of kerosene. The circle appeared overnight, accompanied by a spectacle of lights in the sky. For the police, it was the beginning of a case that would later involve national authorities and end up in the files of CREDOVNE, the Comisión Receptora e Investigadora de Denuncias de Objetos Voladores No Identificados, Uruguay's official government UFO research body. The incident began the previous evening, when a farming family saw bright orbs of light descend over their pasture. According to their testimony, the objects appeared around 10:30 p.m., glowing white with a faint bluish edge. At first, they assumed it was a helicopter from the nearby garrison, but the lights were silent, hovering just above the tree line before lowering into the field. The witnesses described a structured craft, disc-shaped, with a dome and rotating lights along its base. The object hovered for several minutes, emitting a faint humming sound, then settled onto the pasture. The family watched in terror from their farmhouse, unwilling to step outside. After less than 5 minutes, the object lifted vertically without stirring dust or wind, tilted slightly, and then shot skyward until it disappeared. By dawn, curiosity overcame fear. The family went out to the field and discovered the scorched circle. Alarmed, they contacted the local police. Officers responded promptly, driving out in a patrol car. They confirmed the circle and logged it as an unexplained ground trace. Because of its size, nearly 7 meters across, and the absence of ordinary causes, the case was reported up the chain of command. The Tacuarembo Police Department photographed the site and took soil samples. Officers noted the precision of the circle, too even to be caused by random burning. reports were sent to the regional command, which in turn notified the Uruguayan Air Force, FAU, responsible for airspace security. The FAU dispatched personnel from its newly formed UFO Commission, which would later become CRIDOVNI. Military investigators interviewed the farmers and confirmed that no aircraft were scheduled in the area at the time. They also ruled out pranks. The precision of the circle and the depth of the soil damage would have required equipment unavailable to ordinary villagers. Soil samples were sent to laboratories in Montevideo. Analysts found that the soil inside the circle had undergone chemical changes consistent with sudden, intense heating. The clay content had hardened unnaturally, and moisture was almost entirely absent. Yet there were no signs of combustion, such as ash or charred debris. Botanists noted that plants at the circle's edge displayed cellular damage, as though exposed to bursts of radiation or microwave energy. Grass outside the circle was unaffected. These findings ruled out natural explanations, such as lightning strikes, which scatter chaotically rather than producing clean, circular traces. The farmers gave testimony under oath to both police and military investigators. They remained consistent in their accounts, describing the hovering disk, its silent descent, and its sudden vertical departure. They emphasized their fear, explaining why they had not approached the object while it was on the ground. Neighbors in surrounding farms also reported seeing unusual lights that night. Some described glowing spheres rising from the direction of the field. Others said their dogs barked frantically, for no apparent reason. These independent reports reinforced the credibility of the central witnesses. Uruguay is unusual among nations in having an official state body dedicated to UFO investigations. Even in the 1970s, the Air Force's UFO office treated such cases with seriousness, especially when physical evidence was present. The Tacuarembo landing was classified as a CE-2, a close encounter of the second kind, in which a UFO leaves physical traces. Investigators conducted electromagnetic tests at the site and found compass deviations near the center of the circle. Some instruments malfunctioned briefly when brought close to the scorched area. These anomalies were logged in CRIDOVNI's files as unexplained. Skeptics later suggested the circle could have been caused by agricultural equipment or by deliberate hoaxing. But the laboratory results contradicted this. No equipment available locally could have produced the rapid, intense heating indicated by the soil samples. Hoaxers would have left physical residues of fuel or chemicals. None were found. The combination of eyewitness testimony, physical traces, and official laboratory analysis made the Tacuarembo case one of Uruguay's strongest. Researchers often compared it to the more famous Aix-en-Provence case in France, which also involved a disc-shaped craft leaving scorched soil and plant anomalies. For the Uruguayan Air Force, the case was part of a troubling pattern. Throughout the 1970s, rural regions of Uruguay reported repeated UFO activity. Farmers, police officers, and even pilots filed reports of luminous discs and structured craft. The government treated the phenomenon seriously enough to maintain open files, a practice that continues to this day. The Tacuarembo landing underscored the reality that something physical was interacting with the environment. Unlike sightings that could be dismissed as illusions, this case left evidence in the ground, witnessed by police and analyzed by laboratories. The scorched circle faded with time as grass eventually regrew. But the memory of that night never left the family. They remained convinced that what they had seen was not a helicopter, not a trick, but an object of unknown origin. Police officers who had visited the site admitted years later that it was the most baffling case they encountered in their careers. CRIDOVNI retained the file, and researchers today still cite it as one of South America's strongest CE-2 cases. The combination of credible witnesses, official involvement, and physical traces gives it a weight few other cases carry. The Tacuarembo CE-2 remains unexplained. A farming family saw a disc-shaped craft descend into their pasture. Police confirmed the ground trace. The Air Force investigated, laboratories analyzed the soil, and scientists documented anomalies. No ordinary explanation fit the evidence. For the people of Tacuarembo, it was proof that the unknown could appear in the most ordinary of places, a quiet field on a summer night. For the Uruguayan authorities, it was another reminder that the skies over their country held mysteries that resisted conventional answers. And for UFO research, it stands as one of the clearest examples of a case where eyewitnesses, police, and science converged on the same conclusion. Something real and unexplained had landed in that pasture, leaving behind a circle of scorched earth as its only trace. Bahia Blanca abduction. 1973, Argentina. The Argentine city of Bahia Blanca, a port town on the southern edge of Buenos Aires province, was quiet on the night of May 31st, 1973. Streets emptied early, and the last buses rolled past darkened shop fronts. It was along one of these quiet routes that Dionisio Yanca, a 25-year-old truck driver, began what would become one of South America's most controversial abduction cases. His testimony, coupled with physical evidence and the involvement of both police and military authorities, has kept the Bahia Blanca case alive for decades. Yanca had set out shortly before midnight, transporting a load of tires from the port toward Rio Gallegos. His route was familiar, the kind of long haul he had done countless times. He stopped briefly outside the city to check his truck, tightening straps and inspecting his cargo. The night was cool, the roads nearly empty, and all seemed routine. Then, as he was preparing to climb back into the cab, he noticed a light moving low over the fields. At first, he thought it was the headlights of another vehicle cutting across the farmland, but as it drew closer, he realized it was airborne. The object descended silently, oval in shape, glowing with a bluish-white hue. Yanca later described it as large, perhaps 10 meters across, with a dome on top and lights along its rim. It hovered no more than 50 meters away, illuminating the grass in a pale shimmer. Fear took hold. Yanca tried to run toward the truck, but before he could reach it, a beam of light struck him. He recalled feeling paralyzed, unable to move as the object drew closer. Then, he lost consciousness. The next thing he remembered was waking at dawn by the side of the road, disoriented, with his truck parked nearby. He was bleeding from a wound on his head, his clothes disheveled, and his memory fragmented. Stumbling into Bahia Blanca hours later, he collapsed outside a service station. Workers called the Argentine Federal Police, who rushed him to a hospital. Doctors treated his injuries, bruises, cuts, and what appeared to be burns on his face and arms. They noted his confusion and partial amnesia, but also his sincerity. He did not appear drunk or delirious. When questioned by police officers, Yanca insisted he had been taken aboard a craft by figures he could not fully describe. His memories were fractured. Glimpses of a bright interior, sensations of pressure and heat, and the feeling of being observed by beings taller than himself. He claimed they communicated without speaking. The case immediately drew the attention of the Argentine Air Force's intelligence service, which had been monitoring UFO reports throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. officers arrived in Bahia Blanca to interview Lanka, collect his clothing, and examine his truck. They logged his testimony in a classified report. According to local journalists, the Air Force officers were particularly interested in the burns on his skin and the fact that his wristwatch had stopped around the time of the encounter. The provincial police of Buenos Aires also filed their own report, noting the strangeness of the case and forwarding their findings to higher authorities. The involvement of both local police and the Air Force gave the incident unusual weight. Over the following weeks, Lanka underwent hypnosis sessions conducted by Argentine psychiatrists. Under regression, he described being floated aboard the craft, lying on a metallic table and surrounded by 3 figures. He said their faces were difficult to focus on, pale, elongated, with large eyes. They examined him with instruments, touched his skin with devices that emitted light, and seemed to be studying his blood. At one point, he recalled, one of the beings pricked his finger, drawing a sample. When asked under hypnosis what he felt, Lanka responded with fear and helplessness. Yet he also said the beings did not seem hostile, only clinical, as though he were an animal under observation. He remembered nothing further, only waking on the roadside hours later. The press seized on the story. Newspapers across Argentina carried headlines about the truck driver taken by a UFO. Some dismissed it as fantasy. Others treated it as a serious mystery. Radio programs replayed interviews with Lanka, who appeared shy, soft-spoken, and clearly disturbed by what had happened. Skeptics argued that Lanka might have suffered a head injury, causing hallucinations and memory gaps. But doctors who examined him said the burns on his skin were genuine and unlike injuries caused by ordinary accidents. Others suggested he had invented the story for publicity, yet those who knew him described him as modest and reluctant, with no history of seeking attention. The Air Force never released its conclusions, though investigators privately admitted that the case remained unexplained. Leaked accounts suggested that soil samples taken near the truck showed signs of unusual heating, and that Lanka's injuries were consistent with exposure to radiation. Whether these claims were exaggerated is still debated, but they reinforced the belief that the military had taken the case seriously. Over time, the Bahia Blanca abduction became one of the most famous UFO cases in Latin America. It combined elements rarely found together: a credible working-class witness, physical injuries, police documentation, Air Force involvement, and detailed recollections under hypnosis. For Lanka himself, the experience was deeply unsettling. He returned to work as a truck driver, but avoided speaking of the incident except when pressed by researchers. Interviews in later years show him still troubled, insisting that he had no reason to invent what he experienced. "They took me," he said simply. "I don't know why. I don't know who they were. But it happened." Researchers today classify the Bahia Blanca case as a close encounter of the fourth kind, an abduction. Its credibility rests on the convergence of factors: hospital records, police logs, Air Force interviews, and Lanka's consistent testimony over decades. While skeptics remain unconvinced, few deny that something extraordinary happened to him on that night in 1973. The case also reflects Argentina's unique role in global UFO history. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the country became a hotspot for sightings, pilots reporting discs over Bariloche, luminous objects near Cordoba, and abduction accounts in rural provinces. The Air Force's quiet but persistent interest suggested that Argentina, like many nations, was grappling with aerial phenomena beyond easy explanation. Today, the roads outside Bahia Blanca look much the same: flat pampas stretching toward the horizon, dotted with trucks hauling goods across the province. But for those who remember the story, the night of May 31st, 1973, remains singular. It is recalled as the time when an ordinary man, doing an ordinary job, stepped briefly into the extraordinary. A night when light descended, time fractured, and the witness was left changed forever. The Bahia Blanca abduction remains unexplained. No medical condition, no hoax, and no ordinary accident accounts for the convergence of evidence. For Yanka, it was not theory, but memory. The glow in the fields, the paralysis, the figures leaning over him, and the long, empty hours before dawn. For the Argentine authorities, it was another file to be marked unresolved. And for the public, it was a story that blurred the line between the known and the unknown, one that still unsettles those who hear it more than half a century later. The Emilcin abduction. May 10th, 1978. Emilcin, Lublin Voivodeship, Poland. By the late 1970s, Emilcin was like many small villages tucked into the eastern farmland of Poland, quiet, isolated, and largely untouched by modernity. Most families farmed or raised animals. Jan Wolski was 71 years old in the spring of 1978. He had lived in Emilcin his entire life. A modest man, Wolski was known for being calm, hard-working, and deeply rooted in the land. He had never read science fiction. He didn't own a radio. And when he spoke, people listened, not out of deference, but because he rarely said more than necessary. That morning, May 10th, dawn was pale and cool. Wolski rose early, as he always did, and fed the horses. His plan was to deliver a small load of potatoes to a neighboring hamlet. Harnessing his mare to the wooden cart, he rolled down a narrow, rutted forest road just beyond the tree line. Then he saw them. Two figures were walking along the edge of the path. At first, Wolski thought they might be young men from the next village, perhaps mushroom foragers, which wasn't uncommon in spring. But as his cart approached, he slowed. Something about their movements was off. Their limbs moved strangely, too smooth, too fluid. They wore dark, form-fitting overalls made of a material Wolski couldn't identify. Their skin was pale, almost olive gray. Their faces were small and narrow, with almond-shaped eyes set wider apart than seemed natural. They had no visible hair, no eyebrows, no ears. They spoke to each other in a language he could not understand. Quick, sharp syllables that didn't resemble Polish or Ukrainian or anything he'd heard in his lifetime. Wolski didn't panic. He said later that he simply observed, as he always did when working around animals or in the woods. The two figures then silently motioned for him to come with them. No weapons, no force. Just an odd sense of expectation. He climbed off his cart, following them roughly 30 meters into the forest. There, in a clearing he had known since childhood, sat a large object suspended about 5 feet above the ground. It didn't rest on legs or wheels. It floated. The object was boxy, nearly the shape of a small barn, but rounded at the corners. Its surface was metallic, dull white or silver, and seemed seamless, without rivets or seams. A ramp protruded from the lower portion, and without hesitation, the figures walked up it. Wolski followed. Inside was quiet. No hum, no vibration, just silence and a faint smell. He compared it to ozone or freshly cut mushrooms. The interior was lit, but he couldn't see any obvious lamps or bulbs. The light had no source. It simply was. There were 4 other beings inside, dressed the same, speaking the same strange tongue. They motioned to Wolski to remove his clothes. Again, he said later that he felt no fear, only confusion and a sense of being observed, studied, but not harmed. He undressed to his underwear and stood on a platform while one of the beings appeared to inspect him with a small device, no bigger than a deck of cards. It emitted no sound. He wasn't touched. The inspection took less than a minute. Another being opened a small cabinet and removed what looked like a biscuit. Wolski refused to take it. After what he guessed was 15 minutes, the same two beings who had led him into the craft gestured for him to leave. He dressed and stepped back down the ramp. The object remained hovering silently as he returned to his horse and cart. Moments later, from a distance of about 30 meters, Wolski turned back. The craft lifted, without dust, without sound, rose vertically through the trees, and vanished into the sky. The two beings were gone. Wolski arrived home mid-morning and immediately told his family what had happened. His sons, skeptical but curious, walked with him back to the clearing. What they found was simple but undeniable. 4 square impressions in the soil, spaced evenly, each about the size of a shoebox. The grass around them was slightly depressed, as though by weight, not scorched, not broken, just pressed. The trees around the site were untouched. Word spread quickly. Within a day, neighbors and villagers were making their way to the site. Children played near the impressions, mothers whispered, and men smoked silently, glancing upward. 2 days later, a group of researchers arrived from Warsaw. Among them was psychologist and UFO researcher Zbigniew Blania-Bolnar, who conducted interviews and filmed Wolski recounting his experience. The footage still survives today. In it, Wolski appears calm, lucid, and direct. His story never wavers, and he speaks without embellishment. He describes the object as simply as a man might describe a cart or a barn. The beings were not aggressive. The experience, while strange, did not frighten him. When asked why he thought it happened, he only shrugged. They wanted to see, he said, to examine. Blania-Bolnar and his team conducted soil analysis at the site. No radioactive trace was found, no elevated magnetism, just slightly compacted impressions matching Wolski's description of the object's legs or supports. Over time, more witnesses came forward. A boy claimed to have seen a bright light descending toward the woods that morning. A local beekeeper noted that his hives had been unusually quiet on May 10th. A young woman reported hearing a strange buzzing, like wind through metal, at dawn. None of them had spoken to Wolski beforehand. No official investigation followed, at least not one made public. But according to later reports, Poland's Ministry of Internal Affairs, MSW, quietly collected sightings from rural areas throughout the 1970s and 1980s, especially cases involving visual craft or ground traces. Internal memos from the era, later obtained by Polish researchers, suggest that Wolski's case was noted but never acted on. Years passed, and Wolski continued farming, tending his horses, and attending Sunday Mass. He never changed his story, never sought attention. When asked again in the 1980s by another visiting researcher, if he stood by what he said, he simply nodded. There was nothing to gain, he said. Why would I lie? In 2005, a monument was erected at the edge of the Emilcin forest, a tall stone column with a stylized depiction of the craft, and an inscription that reads, "On 10th May, 1978 in Emilcin, a UFO object landed. The truth will astonish us in the future." To this day, the story remains one of Poland's most widely documented and investigated UFO cases. Blania Bolnar's reports were published in national journals. The Polish government never issued a formal statement. For researchers of high strangeness, Emilcin represents something rare, a case with a singular witness of high credibility, immediate physical impressions, psychological evaluation, and secondary local corroboration, all within a Cold War Eastern Bloc setting, far from Western media influence. And for the village itself, the story never became spectacle. It stayed what it always was, a strange morning, quietly told, quietly remembered. Why Jan Wolski was chosen, or what exactly the beings were looking for, remains unknown. But Emilcin remembers. Even if the world does not, the Zanfreda abductions, December 6, 1978, Torriglia, Italy. The Fiat's headlights pierced the dense fog curling through the Ligurian mountains, illuminating narrow ribbons of asphalt and frozen stone walls. Midnight was near in the village of Torriglia, and the road to the remote vacation estate known as Villa Casa Nostra was deserted. No other cars, no sounds, only the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of tires over ice. Inside the tiny security patrol vehicle, Pier Fortunato Zanfretta gripped the wheel tighter than usual. He didn't know why, but something felt wrong. Minutes later, he parked and stepped out, boots sinking into damp soil, flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air was dense, almost charged. A strange pressure built in his ears, as if the atmosphere itself were reacting to something unseen. His breath fogged before him in short, uneasy bursts as he approached the villa grounds. Then, the silence shattered. A movement, quick, massive, stirred the hedgerows. Zanfretta stopped. His light caught something that shouldn't have been there. Towering figures, nearly 3 meters tall, standing motionless in the bushes. Their skin was scaled and greenish. Their eyes glowed yellow. They wore bulky metallic suits, hissing faintly. Zanfretta's mouth went dry. He reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, a searing white light enveloped him. He screamed. The radio in his car crackled to life. "Zanfretta, come in." No response, only static. And then, huge, terrible beings. They're here. The transmission cut out. When the carabinieri found him an hour later, the patrol car's engine was still running. Zanfretta sat inside, shaking, unable to speak, his eyes wide with terror. Burn marks marred his uniform. His pistol was back in its holster, untouched, though he had no memory of ever retrieving it. The official report would list the time as 1:10 a.m. That moment marked the beginning of one of the most chilling and well-documented alien abduction cases in European history. In the hours that followed, Zanfretta attempted to recount what had happened. He spoke of being lifted into a craft by a column of blinding light, of being surrounded by enormous reptilian beings who communicated telepathically. They said they were from the third galaxy, a planet orbiting Tau Ceti. They had been watching, studying, waiting, and he had been chosen. The media storm began almost immediately. Italy's major newspapers ran headlines about the terrified security guard who claimed to have met extraterrestrials. Many scoffed, but the Carabinieri's report, publicly available, spoke of emotional shock, physical traces, and a serious, consistent account. It was enough to attract the attention of researchers, psychologists, and skeptics alike. In the weeks that followed, Zanfretta underwent a series of hypnosis sessions under the guidance of Dr. Mauro Moretti from the International Center of Medical Hypnosis in Milan. These sessions were recorded and analyzed. Under hypnosis, Zanfretta described multiple abductions, each time providing new and consistent details. He spoke of glowing panels, alien machinery, and a clear warning: humans were not ready for contact. The descriptions never wavered. The beings were huge, at least 9 feet tall, with bumpy skin, clawed hands, and glowing eyes. Their technology was beyond comprehension, and yet their tone was strangely clinical, even cold. In one session, Zanfretta broke down in tears, recalling how one creature had inserted a clear sphere into his skull. It was meant to monitor him, they said. His role was not just as a witness, but as an unwilling messenger. More unsettling still were the repeated disappearances. On several occasions in 1979 and 1980, Zanfretta vanished from his patrol route, only to be found hours later in distant locations, dazed, drenched in sweat, and suffering from amnesia. During one incident, other guards reported seeing a strange light shoot into the sky moments before Zanfretta's radio went silent. When he was found, he could barely speak. Investigators documented the cases thoroughly. Soil samples from the original site were compressed and slightly scorched. Semicircular indentations in the earth suggested the presence of an extremely heavy object. Witnesses from the village reported strange lights in the sky on the night of the first abduction. One local, a mechanic named Carlo Rossi, said his dog barked wildly and refused to go near the wooded area near the villa for days. Yet perhaps the most convincing evidence was Zanfretta himself. He never sought money, fame, or publicity. He turned down book offers. He refused most media appearances. When he finally did appear on Italian television in the mid-1880s, it was clear he was uncomfortable. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted nervously as he recounted his story once more. Despite this, his account remained unchanged. Journalist Rino Di Stefano, who investigated the case for over a decade, interviewed Zanfretta numerous times and reviewed official police files, hypnosis tapes, and corroborating witness statements. He became convinced that Zanfretta believed every word he said and had suffered tremendously because of it. Di Stefano published multiple articles and a book compiling the vast documentation behind the case. The public remained divided. Skeptics argued that Zanfretta might have suffered hallucinations or psychological trauma, though extensive mental health evaluations at the time found no signs of psychosis or delusion. Others believed that his story fit too closely with emerging accounts of alien abductions around the world to be coincidence. In the small town of Torriglia, where the hills are still quiet and the roads still twist through the mountains, memories of that strange winter night linger. A small plaque near the villa now marks the alleged landing site, placed there not as proof, but as recognition of one man's unwavering testimony. Zanfretta, now retired and living in obscurity, rarely speaks publicly anymore, but he never recanted. In a rare interview decades later, he said quietly, "I didn't want this. I still wish it had never happened, but I can't forget what I saw, and I never will." The case remains open, both literally and figuratively. No one has been able to disprove Zanfretta's account, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. If what he claimed was true, then we are not alone. And someone, or something, chose a solitary night watchman in a mountain village to remind us of that fact. The Alagamar abduction, 1991, Alagamar, Maranhão, Brazil. The night river was mirror still, reflecting only moonlight and the ripple of distant insects. 4 fishermen, Jose, Miguel, Raul, and old João, had built a small fire on the sandy bank of the Gurupi River near Alagamar, Maranhão. They were on their usual night expedition, harvesting freshwater crayfish in the winding waterway. rainforest darkness enveloped them, broken only by the soft glow of their flames and the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Just past midnight, the firelight flickered unnaturally. The men exchanged puzzled glances. Then, from the tree line on the opposite bank, came bright lights, like searchlights, intensely white and steady, slowly descending between the trees. At first, they thought it might be a passing boat or low-flying helicopter, but as the lights approached, their calm water set no ripples, their hum made no sound, and their brilliance didn't soften. The beams converged and illuminated the fire-lit camp in stark brilliance. The four fishermen froze. Raoul, closest to the river, stepped back into the water and vanished. One moment, he was diving for a crayfish basket. The next, he was gone. Panicked, Jose cried out. Miguel and João ran toward the forest's edge. The bright lights pulsed again. The night became oppressive with their sudden absence and the unnatural radiance. They called out for Raoul, but only echoes returned. Moments stretched. Then, as abruptly as they had come, the lights vanished, one by one, retreating upward into the night until the forest canopy swallowed them. The darkness crept back over the river, and only the soft crackle of the dying campfire remained. Shaken, the two men stumbled to the shoreline and found Raoul gasping and soaked, standing knee-deep in water. Dazed, his face was pale, his eyes vacant. He spoke no word. Miguel screamed for help. Old João yelled for a doctor. Within 20 minutes, they had carried him to their boat and began a frantic journey to the nearest town, some 40 kilometers upriver. By dawn, they reached a clinic in a small riverside town. The doctor, initially skeptical, found Raoul severely disoriented. He couldn't recall how he'd disappeared, or even his name at times. On his hands and forearms were reddish burn marks, circular and precise, unlike common burns or insect bites. The doctor noted them carefully. A strange pattern of healing lesions on his skin. Before long, local authorities became involved. The fishermen's statements were recorded in a police file. Each recounted the lights, the sudden vanishing, and Raoul's reappearance. But none had any explanation. They reported no boat, no aircraft, no collector's torch. Just lights descending silently from the forest, and their friend returning minutes later with no memory. The fishermen were experienced river workers, accustomed to the isolation of the Maranhão rainforest. Their daily lives depended on routine and nature's steadiness. But that night, routine shattered. The remote riverbank had felt safe, or at least predictable. The bright lights broke that trust and toppled their world in an instant. Despite Raoul's shock, the men insisted they continue. They packed camp quickly, but none slept. The river felt colder, darker, unsettled. Even the animals seemed on edge. Mosquitoes swarmed, eels darted at the edges of their lamps' glow, birds screeched overhead, like alarms. Multiple witnesses agreed. 3 distinct beams of white light, cold, silent, and glassy, emerged between treetops and approached the camp. The lights didn't cast shadows, but flattened depth, making the fire's glow seem weak. Nobody estimated how high the lights hovered, but they were bright enough to affect night vision. Raoul's disappearance was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was bending over the water, the next he was gone, submerged in water, with no splash, no disturbance. He reappeared moments later, uneasy and confused. The lights pulsed once more and retreated into the forest, extinguishing as mysteriously as they had appeared. The fisherman described a sense of being scanned, watched, and protected oddly. At the clinic, Raul could not speak coherently for an hour. His family and friends recognized him, but said he seemed hollow, like he carried a distance in his eyes. His burns, 2 concentric circles, about an inch wide, were painful. The doctor could find no logical cause, no campfire spark, no insect hive, no chemical exposure. Raul later insisted he had seen nothing after the lights. Just darkness, he said. Then I was here. His memory came back slowly and incompletely. He blinked as if perceiving his own hands for the first time. The police recorded the testimony meticulously. Officers noted the men's fear and consistency in recollection. No money or benefit was sought. They were fishermen, deeply tied to the land and water, and unnerved. Over the following weeks, Alagamar saw increased reports of strange events, bright lights over the river, disappearances of fishing nets, strange ripples in water at night. A few villagers reported hearing humming vibrations near the shore. Some felt light pulses against their skin when they walked near the forest edge at dawn. By late 1991, a Brazilian UFO research group visited the site. They documented multiple accounts of the original incident and several smaller anomalies. Soil samples from the riverbank where Raul vanished had subtle discoloration and magnetic irregularities, though no radiation. Photographic records of the burns and of Raul's dazed state were taken. Medical notes confirmed his acute disorientation, memory loss, and circular burns. Local press featured the story for weeks. Editors translated the English idiom abduction into raptura cautiously. The case became a minor national curiosity, but remote enough to avoid sensational headlines. 2 critical documents support the incident: the official police records from Alagamar and the medical records by the attending doctor. Copies circulated to UFO research groups in Brazil in the early 1990s. They include consistent descriptions of the burns, round lesions, strong headaches, and short-term amnesia. Photos of Raul's arms and forearms, still marked after 2 weeks, exist in archived files. Research group logs correlate several reported sightings near the area through late 1991. None as dramatic, but consistent with bright nighttime lights above the river and forest. This case fits the archetype of wilderness abductions: isolated location, small group of non-sensational eyewitnesses, sudden disappearance and return, physical evidence, and partial memory loss. Yet it remains singular in Brazil for its credible local records and multiple witnesses who never sought publicity. The Gurupi River Basin is remote, dense, rich in biodiversity, and rarely visited at night. Yet that isolation might make it a beacon for certain phenomena. Other communities in Maranhão report seeing lights near rivers, and sometimes people report missing time. Could the natural darkness, humidity, and forest canopy focus or attract these events? Was Raul deliberately chosen, or was his disappearance accidental collateral? Did the lights serve as drawing or scanning systems? Were they technological probes or natural anomalies responding to human settlement? Decades later, the Alagamar abduction remains largely known only to Brazilian UFO scholars. Most official agencies have not revisited the case. No explanatory theory has been published. Raul has long since returned to fishing, haunted but resilient. His burns healed. His memory, though fragmented, holds firm the faint echo of circular lights and sudden absence. For those who study such contact events, especially in isolated regions, The Alagamar incident stands as evidence that strange encounters often follow recurring patterns: remote wilderness, nighttime lights, sudden vanishing, burns, amnesia, and community silence. It leaves us asking, why here? Why then? And above all, why the silence that followed? The Sikuani entity encounter. 2002, Sikuani, Peru. The Andean night was quiet, cold, and clear. Stars shimmered like scattered diamonds across the black sky. On the steep mountain slopes above the rural outskirts of Sikuani, a small group of shepherds gathered near a low fire. Their day had ended, their flocks tethered nearby, and the bitter wind carried the faint bleats of restless sheep through the open pasture. Martin Ramos, his younger brother Julio, and their cousin Mateo had worked these fields for years. They knew the highlands intimately. Every rocky outcrop, every patch of grass where their animals grazed. On this night, though, the familiar terrain felt oddly tense. The animals were uneasy. The usual calm of the highlands had shifted into something they couldn't quite explain. Around midnight, Martin noticed a soft orange glow peeking over the southern ridge. At first, he assumed it was a fire, perhaps a cooking flame or torch from another herder. But the light grew brighter, more focused, and began to descend silently into the valley below. What emerged from the darkness defied explanation. Hovering just above the field was a glowing orb, roughly the size of a small car. It pulsed gently, casting long shadows and bathing the pasture in an amber hue. The orb moved slowly, deliberately, drifting a few meters above the ground without a sound. The three men stood frozen. Then they saw it. Near the orb, no more than 10 meters away, stood a figure, tall, humanoid, and utterly still. It was difficult to gauge its features in the glow, but the being appeared to be well over 2 meters tall. Its skin, or suit, was a silvery gray. The being neither approached nor retreated. It simply watched. A strange silence fell over the scene, broken only by the frantic rustling of the sheep. Several tried to bolt from their enclosures. Others huddled against the ground, trembling. Julio later described the moment. It was like time didn't know what to do. Everything slowed down. Panic took over. Martin shouted for the others to run. The three men fled down the slope, heart pounding, stumbling over uneven terrain. When they reached a lower pasture, they turned to look back. The orb and the figure were gone. By morning, word had already spread through the village. Despite initial hesitancy, the three shepherds gave a full account to local authorities. The police, skeptical but respectful, accompanied them to the field. What they found astonished them. A large circular patch of dead grass where the orb had hovered, with soil turned dry and brittle. Some of the rocks in the area were scorched black. Veterinarians who later examined the sheep noted heightened heart rates and stress indicators, though none were injured. Several animals refused to return to the pasture for weeks. Radio stations in Cusco picked up the story, and within days, the Sikuani encounter had become a regional mystery. Local news outlets interviewed Martin and Julio, who described the being as taller than any man, but thinner, like it had been stretched by the sky. The Peruvian Air Force refused to comment. A few days later, university researchers from Cusco arrived to take samples. Their early analysis showed no signs of chemical contamination or radioactivity, but noted unusual mineral patterns in the soil. When pressed, one researcher admitted, "This isn't something we see from natural weathering or agriculture." Martin Ramos could barely sleep in the nights that followed. He described vivid dreams of the entity, not threatening, but unsettling. It was like being examined without being touched, he said. Like it was curious, but it didn't want us to know why. He began recording his memories in a notebook, which he would eventually pass to his daughter decades later. In it, he sketched the orb and the being over and over again, each one more precise than the last. The town priest suggested it may have been a spiritual warning or test of faith. An elder farmer swore the same orb had been seen near Lake Titicaca during his youth. An old Quechua tale was revived, one of the Watchers of the Wind, silent beings who visit only when they need to understand mankind again. In time, the place where the being had stood became known as El Claro del Silencio, the clearing of silence. Crops planted there withered faster. Even in rainy seasons, the soil stayed oddly dry. Children told stories of a silent figure who still roamed the hills after dark. Martin and his family moved down the valley in 2004. He never again visited that upper pasture. But the incident continued to draw the occasional traveler, researcher, or spiritual pilgrim. Small expeditions came looking for answers. Some left with strange readings, others left with nothing. But nearly all remarked on the same sensation. The land felt watched. In 2015, a local news crew tried to revisit the story, interviewing aging villagers and combing through forgotten radio archives. They found a recording of a 2002 radio interview in which Julio said, "It didn't threaten us. It didn't chase us. But when it looked at me, I knew we weren't supposed to be there. That place was meant for something else." No further sightings occurred in the valley after 2002, but strange lights continued to be seen in the greater Andes, flickering silently over ridges, sometimes lingering for hours, then vanishing without a trace. Martin died in 2020. At his funeral, his daughter shared pages from the notebook he had kept since that night. One quote stood out. "If it had wanted to hurt us, it could have. But it didn't. It only wanted to be seen. Or maybe it wanted us to know that we were the ones being studied." The Sikuani entity encounter remains one of Peru's most puzzling rural UFO cases, quiet, sudden, and never repeated. No aircraft were reported in the region that night. No satellites passed overhead. The sheep have long since returned to the hill, but the locals still give the pasture a wide berth when the sun goes down. The calm, tall figure did nothing, but its presence changed everything.